In this gripping story about racism in America, Dr. Elijah Monroe, a highly respected black surgeon, becomes the target of a corrupt system driven by prejudice. After a fabricated accusation of prescription fraud, Elijah is publicly humiliated and unjustly arrested, orchestrated by a racist cop and powerful hospital administrators seeking to cover up their own crimes. As the situation spirals, Elijah faces systemic racism, abuse of power, and a community hesitant to take his side. The story reveals the devastating impact of racial bias and the infuriating lengths some will go to silence those who challenge injustice. The early morning sun glared off the rows of parked cars outside Riverbrook Community Center. The Saturday market buzzed with life. Families wandered from booth to booth, the scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee filling the air. Among the crowd was James Bailey, a 45-year-old veteran and single father of two. James had the look of a man who'd weathered storms, broad shoulders, sharp features, and a quiet, watchful demeanor. For him, this was more than a market, it was an escape. His 14-year-old son Tyler trailed behind him, earbuds in and hands shoved deep into his hoodie. Tyler wasn't thrilled to be here, but James insisted. "Life's about showing up, even when you don't want to," he always said. James waved at a vendor he knew from his military days, exchanging pleasantries as Tyler hovered near the edge of the crowd. That's when it happened. A sharp voice slicing through the hum of morning chatter. "Hey, step away from there!" James turned instinctively, his stomach tightening. He spotted a security guard, mid-40s, stocky with a puffed-out chest, striding toward Tyler. The guard's name tag glinted in the sunlight. Officer Grant. Tyler looked up, startled, as the man's accusations began. "I said step back. What were you doing over there?" Grant barked, his voice loud enough to turn heads. Tyler blinked, pulling his earbuds out. I wasn't doing anything." Grant's hand twitched toward the radio on his belt. "Don't play dumb, kid. You were loitering near the vendors' cars. You planning to steal something?" James's pulse roared in his ears. "Steal something." Tyler's face flushed, his teenage confidence faltering under the weight of the accusation. "I wasn't anywhere near the cars," Tyler protested, his voice cracking. "Don't lie to me," Grant spat, taking a step closer. "Show me what's in your pockets." By now, the crowd was watching, a circle of whispered conversations and averted eyes. James pushed through the bystanders, his hands clenching at his sides as he approached. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. Grant turned, sizing James up. "This kid, your kid, was hanging around where he shouldn't be, probably casing the place." James's jaw tightened. "Casing? He's a kid. He wasn't doing anything." Grant didn't back down. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and pointed at Tyler. "Then you won't mind if I check his pockets?" The world seemed to narrow around James, the noise of the market fading into a low hum. Tyler stood frozen, his gaze darting between his father and Grant. It wasn't just about emptying his pockets, it was about the humiliation of it, the unspoken accusation that hung in the air like a threat. "You're not checking anything," James said quietly, stepping between his son and the guard. "And you'd better have a reason to make these accusations." Grant's eyes hardened, his hand hovering near the cuffs on his belt. "Are you interfering, sir?" For a moment, no one spoke. The onlookers shifted uneasily, whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. James knew what was happening, knew how quickly things could escalate, but he wasn't backing down. Not today. "Interfering?" James said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm protecting my son. Now, unless you have proof he did something wrong, I suggest you back off." But Grant didn't move. Instead, his hand closed around his radio, his words ringing out loud and clear. "Unit 5, I need backup." Tyler's breath hitched. James felt the air shift. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was the beginning of something bigger, something neither of them could walk away from, and James knew they were out of time. The morning sun painted the small town of Crestview in soft gold, its rays skimming over the weathered rooftops and quiet streets. For the locals, it was a place defined by routine. Church bells on Sundays, neighbors who knew everyone's business, and the unspoken rules that governed who belonged and who didn't. For Dr. Elijah Monroe, Crestview was a reminder of both how far he had come and how far the world still had to go. Elijah, a 48-year-old cardiothoracic surgeon, was one of the most renowned doctors in the state. His skill had saved lives from coast to coast, and his name carried weight in medical circles. But here, in Crestview, a town where outsiders were noticed before they were welcomed, Elijah was still something of an enigma. Despite his wealth and prestige, Elijah preferred a life of quiet dignity. He didn't own flashy cars, nor did he flaunt his successes. Instead, he drove a modest black sedan, lived in a stately but understated home on the outskirts of town, and spent his mornings in the small diner on Willow Street. It wasn't the type of place someone of his stature would normally frequent, but Elijah liked it that way. In a world obsessed with appearances, anonymity felt like a luxury. On this particular morning, Elijah sat at his usual corner table, a cup of black coffee steaming beside his half-read newspaper. The diner was nearly empty save for a few regulars, a retired couple sharing a plate of pancakes, two mechanics from the nearby auto shop discussing engine repairs, and the waitress, Shelley, who moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been working the morning shift for decades. "Refill, Doc?" Shelley asked, her voice friendly but distant. Elijah smiled faintly and nodded. "Please, Shelley." She poured the coffee and lingered for a moment, wiping the table next to his. "You're here earlier than usual today? Busy day at the hospital?" "Something like that," Elijah replied, folding the paper neatly in front of him. "I've got meetings, but I like to enjoy a quiet morning first." Shelley offered a small smile before shuffling off to the counter, leaving Elijah to his thoughts. From the window, Elijah could see Crestview waking up. A beat-up pickup truck rumbled past, the driver tipping his hat toward no one in particular. A group of teenagers on bicycles zigzagged across the empty street, their laughter bouncing off brick facades. It was a town stuck in time, unhurried and content in its smallness. But not everyone felt content here. Elijah knew this all too well. As a black man who had grown up in less forgiving places, he'd learned how to navigate environments like Crestview, places where smiles were often accompanied by wary glances, and friendliness could turn brittle with the wrong word. People here were polite, but politeness wasn't the same as acceptance. He took a sip of his coffee, allowing himself a moment of peace before the day unfolded. That's when he noticed them. Two men, both white, both unfamiliar, had walked into the diner. They wore jeans and work boots, their flannel shirts worn and stained. Something about their presence felt deliberate, as though they weren't here for the pancakes. They lingered near the counter, muttering to each other while casting occasional glances in Elijah's direction. Elijah felt it before he heard it. The subtle shift in the air. The quiet tension that accompanied being noticed. It wasn't unusual. People often looked at him twice, sometimes because they recognized him, other times because they couldn't reconcile his tailored suit and dignified air with their assumptions. But this was different. One of the men, taller and broad-shouldered, finally spoke. "Morning," he said, his voice loud enough to carry across the diner. "Kinda early for a guy like you to be out, isn't it?" Shelley, who had been refilling coffee at the other table, froze for a beat before continuing her work. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, heads lowering toward their plates. It was the kind of moment Crestview was good at. Silent complicity. Elijah set his coffee down slowly, his movements measured and calm. He turned his gaze toward the man, his face betraying nothing but polite interest. "Pardon me?" The man smirked. "I said it's early. Guess I just don't see many well-dressed folks around here unless there's something going on." Elijah held the man's gaze for a moment before replying. "I like my coffee quiet, and my mornings earlier than most, I'm sure you understand." The man's smirk faltered slightly. There was something about Elijah, his quiet confidence, his refusal to be rattled, that unsettled people who expected deference. His presence alone disrupted the fragile balance of power that men like this relied on. The second man, leaner and younger, nudged his friend and muttered something Elijah couldn't hear. The taller man waved him off, his smirk returning. "Relax, we're just making conversation. You're not from around here, are you?" Elijah folded his hands neatly on the table. "I've lived here for 3 years." "That so?" The man glanced around the diner, as though inviting others to share in his amusement. "Funny I haven't seen you before." Elijah's smile was tight. "Perhaps you weren't looking." A beat of silence passed. Shelley finally stepped in, her voice sharp with forced cheerfulness. "You boys want coffee or what? Otherwise, I've got work to do." The taller man shrugged and muttered something under his breath before turning back to the counter. Elijah resumed his coffee, but he could still feel their eyes on him, testing, measuring, waiting. This wasn't new to him. Elijah had spent a lifetime walking this tightrope. In the operating room, his hands held the power of life and death. His decisions were final, his authority unquestioned. But out here, in diners, grocery stores, and town hall meetings, he was often reduced to a symbol, a question mark that people like these two men didn't know how to answer. And yet, Elijah refused to shrink. Refusing to shrink was its own quiet rebellion. The door chimed again, and Elijah's attention was drawn to the newcomer. It was Deputy Roy Harlan, Crestview's resident law enforcement, and a man whose reputation was as inconsistent as his loyalties. He strode in with his uniform crisp, a toothpick perched in the corner of his mouth. He greeted Shelley with a nod, before noticing Elijah. "Well, morning, Doc," Harlan said, a smile spreading across his face. "Didn't expect to see you here today." "Good morning, Deputy," Elijah replied, his voice even. Harlan sauntered over to the men at the counter, clapping the taller one on the shoulder. "Didn't know you two were back in town. What brings you boys out so early?" The men murmured something in response, and Harlan's gaze flickered briefly to Elijah. Whatever they said, it earned a chuckle from the deputy, who shook his head as though indulging an old joke. Elijah didn't miss it. The glance, the laugh, the quiet understanding between them. He finished his coffee, folded his newspaper, and stood, smoothing his jacket with practiced ease. As he walked toward the door, Shelley called after him, her tone almost apologetic. "Have a good day, Doc?" Elijah turned, offering her a small smile. "You too, Shelley. Thank you." Outside, the town felt colder. Elijah slipped his hands into his coat pockets and walked toward his car, the gravel crunching under his polished shoes. He could still feel their stares through the diner window, but he didn't turn back. Instead, he let the tension roll off him, just as he always did. But even as he drove away, something lingered, a weight in his chest, a whisper in his mind. This wasn't over. Whatever had begun in that diner was just the first step, and Elijah knew what was coming. He'd seen it before. The low hum of Elijah Monroe's sedan engine filled the quiet streets of Crestview. He drove with one hand resting lightly on the wheel, the other drumming against his knee, his mind replaying the encounter at the diner. It wasn't the first time strangers had tried to bait him. Small-town hostility was often quiet, but men like those two had a way of making it loud. Still, something about it unsettled him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing a truck 2 cars back. A large, rusted Ford with oversized tires, the same one parked outside the diner. Elijah exhaled slowly, telling himself it was nothing. But his instincts, sharpened over years of quiet battles, told a different story. Pulling into the Crestview General Hospital parking lot, Elijah parked near the employee entrance and stepped out of the car. He adjusted his overcoat, the sharp lines of his tailored suit cutting an impressive figure. In the world of medicine, Elijah was regarded as a man of precision, someone who inspired confidence with a single glance. Inside, the sterile smell of disinfectant greeted him as he walked down the long hallways toward his office. The hospital was one of Crestview's few modern buildings, a lifeline for residents in surrounding counties. Elijah had worked here for 3 years, splitting his time between Crestview and larger medical centers in the city. Patients traveled hours to see him, trusting that when Elijah Monroe entered the operating room, they were in the best hands possible. As he approached his office, Elijah noticed a figure waiting outside his door. Dr. Stephen Barnes, a surgeon with far less experience, but far more ego. Barnes leaned against the wall, a smug expression fixed on his face as Elijah approached. "Morning, Monroe," Barnes said, straightening up. "Didn't expect you in so early." "Dr. Barnes," Elijah replied, unlocking his office door and stepping inside. Barnes followed uninvited, hands in the pockets of his white coat. "Big day, huh? You're taking over the Patterson surgery this afternoon, aren't you?" Barnes's tone was casual, but his words carried an edge, one Elijah recognized. "Yes," Elijah said evenly. "Is there an issue?" "Not an issue exactly," Barnes said, pacing slowly. I just think it's interesting. A case that delicate being handed to you. I mean, Patterson's family's got deep ties here. Big donors, people notice these things. Elijah turned, meeting Barnes's gaze with quiet intensity. Are you questioning my qualifications, Dr. Barnes? Barnes chuckled, a hollow sound meant to disarm. Not at all. Just saying that appearances matter. You wouldn't want to make anyone uncomfortable if, things don't go perfectly. Elijah felt the words like a stone sinking in his chest. The implication was clear. Barnes was reminding him of his place, not as a surgeon, but as an outsider. A black man in a position some in Crestview still believed he didn't deserve. I'm sure the Pattersons will be more comfortable knowing I'm performing the procedure, Elijah said calmly. Now, if you don't mind, I have work to do. Barnes lingered for a moment longer, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his face before he turned and left. Elijah sank into his chair, his jaw tight. Appearances matter. The words echoed in his mind, more insidious than any outright insult. It wasn't just Barnes. It was the entire system of silent, unspoken rules that dictated how men like Elijah were perceived. He knew his skill, his experience, his years of life-saving work. But none of that mattered to people who saw him as nothing more than a question mark in their world. The Patterson surgery was scheduled for noon, but Elijah's day was already full of consultations. He met with patients in quiet rooms, his tone calm, his explanations clear and deliberate. To his patients, he was a lifeline, a man whose voice carried hope and reassurance. But even in the hospital, there were moments, small ones, microaggressions that chipped away at him like constant blows to a stone. The nurse who hesitated when Elijah asked for a report, double-checking with a younger white doctor to confirm. The orderly who addressed him as sir instead of doctor. The administrator who greeted him with a clipped smile and said, "It's nice to see you here today," as though his presence were a surprise. Elijah noticed them all. He always noticed. By late morning, Elijah stood outside the operating room, scrubbing his hands with meticulous care. The familiar rhythm of preparation was a comfort, a ritual that reminded him who he was. "Dr. Monroe," said Claire Yates, the OR nurse, peeking into the prep room. "The Pattersons are here. Mr. Patterson wanted to meet you before we proceed." Elijah glanced up. That wasn't unusual. Families often wanted reassurance, but something in Claire's tone gave him pause. "I'll speak with them," Elijah said, his voice calm. Claire hesitated. "They asked if Dr. Barnes could join us. I tried to explain that you're leading the surgery, but—" "I understand," Elijah interrupted gently, hiding the irritation bubbling beneath his surface. "I'll handle it." He dried his hands and stepped into the consultation room. The Pattersons, an older couple with an air of old money, sat in stiff-backed chairs. The wife clutched her purse tightly in her lap, her gaze darting up as Elijah entered. "Mr. and Mrs. Patterson," Elijah greeted, his voice steady. "I'm Dr. Monroe. I'll be performing your husband's procedure today." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Long Mrs. Patterson's eyes flicked to the door, as though hoping someone else might walk through it. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat, his expression tight. "Dr. Monroe," he said slowly, as though tasting the words. "It's good to meet you, I have to say. We were expecting Dr. Barnes." Elijah forced a reassuring smile. "Dr. Barnes is part of the team, but I'll be leading the surgery. I've reviewed your case thoroughly, and you're in very good hands." Mrs. Patterson's lips thinned. "No offense, doctor, but we're just a little surprised. We assumed someone more familiar." Elijah finished for her, his tone soft but pointed. Mr. Patterson shifted uncomfortably. "Experienced. That's all. Dr. Barnes has been here a long time." Elijah clasped his hands behind his back, keeping his posture open and confident. "I assure you, my experience speaks for itself. I've performed this procedure hundreds of times, and my success rate is among the highest in the state." Mrs. Patterson avoided his gaze. Mr. Patterson muttered something under his breath and looked away. "Is there anything else I can clarify for you?" Elijah asked, his calm veneer unwavering. When neither of them spoke, he nodded once. "I'll see you in the operating room." Elijah turned and left, his chest tight with a frustration that burned like acid. In the hallway, he took a deep breath, releasing it slowly. Stay focused, stay steady. Back in the OR, the team was ready. Claire handed Elijah his gloves, her expression apologetic. "You okay, Dr. Monroe?" she asked quietly. Elijah slid on his gloves and glanced toward the doors. "I'm fine. Let's save a life." The surgery lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of steady hands and quiet precision. When Elijah emerged from the OR, his scrubs damp with sweat, Mr. Patterson's condition was stable, the procedure a complete success. Elijah knew the Pattersons would never thank him. Not really. Their gratitude would go to the hospital, or to Barnes, or to the system that they trusted. But Elijah didn't do it for gratitude. He did it because he was a surgeon, and this was what he did. As Elijah made his way toward his office, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, frowning when he saw an unfamiliar number. He answered, holding it to his ear. "Dr. Monroe," a voice said, low, deliberate. "You think you can just walk into this town and change how things work?" Elijah stopped walking. The voice was familiar, and though it wasn't named, he knew. "I don't know who this is," Elijah said calmly, "but I'd suggest you think carefully before saying anything else." The voice chuckled darkly. "Men like you don't last long around here. You should know your place." The line went dead. Elijah lowered the phone slowly, staring at the black screen. He exhaled sharply, his chest tight with the weight of something he couldn't yet name. He'd felt this before. The quiet storm building, the subtle threats bubbling to the surface. Crestview was stirring, and Elijah knew it was only a matter of time before the mask slipped completely. Whatever was coming, he would face it. But this time, he wouldn't face it alone. The day that changed everything began like any other. Elijah Monroe stood in front of the hospital boardroom, adjusting his tie as he prepared for a meeting he had been invited to only an hour prior. The vague request had come through his assistant. A matter of great importance, they had said. Elijah, accustomed to last-minute demands, hadn't thought much of it. The moment he stepped inside the room, however, he knew something was wrong. The board members, 6 men and women, all seated at the long mahogany table, were unusually quiet. At the head sat Harold Klein, the hospital's president. Klein was an older man with silver hair and a carefully practiced smile, the kind of man who never spoke plainly unless he had to. "Elijah, take a seat," Klein said, gesturing to the empty chair at the far end of the table. Elijah sat down slowly, his gaze sweeping across the room. There was no small talk, no exchange of pleasantries. The air was thick with unspoken words. "What's this about?" Elijah asked, his voice even but firm. Klein leaned forward, folding his hands together on the table. "We've received a troubling complaint, Elijah." "Complaint?" Elijah repeated, his brows knitting. Klein cleared his throat. "About you." A ripple of disbelief passed through Elijah. He kept his expression controlled, his posture straight. "I don't understand." Klein hesitated, as though savoring the pause. "It's been brought to our attention that you mishandled the Patterson surgery. Specifically, that you acted recklessly and put the patient at unnecessary risk." For a moment, Elijah thought he had misheard. "The Patterson surgery?" His voice was sharp now. "The same surgery that was a success?" "Success is subjective," Klein replied smoothly, though a hint of discomfort flickered across his face. "Mr. Patterson's family has expressed concerns that Dr. Barnes has corroborated." Barnes. Elijah's teeth clenched at the name. Of course, this wasn't about surgery, it was about something far deeper, something uglier. "This is absurd," Elijah said, his calm demeanor straining under the weight of his anger. "I performed that procedure flawlessly. You have the charts, the vitals, and the patient's stable condition to prove it." One of the board members, Mitchell Crane, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Mitchell was a younger administrator, one of the few who had shown Elijah respect since his arrival. He avoided Elijah's gaze now, staring at his folded hands on the table. "Elijah," Mitchell said hesitantly, his voice low, "the board has decided that, pending a full review, you'll be placed on temporary administrative leave." The words hit Elijah like a blow. He sat back, stunned. "Leave based on what evidence?" Klein's smile was as cold as it was condescending. "This is standard protocol, I'm sure you understand." Standard protocol. Elijah knew what that meant. It was a smokescreen, a way to remove him under the pretense of neutrality. His mind raced. This wasn't about medical performance, this was about Barnes, about the whispers in town, about the unspoken rules he had dared to defy. "Klein," Elijah said quietly, his voice low and dangerous. "This isn't about Patterson's surgery. It's about me, isn't it?" A silence settled over the room. No one spoke. No one would meet his eyes. Klein leaned back, his smile tight. "You've been a valued asset here, Dr. Monroe. But sometimes it's better for everyone to step back and reassess." Elijah stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. He looked at each member of the board, searching for a flicker of guilt, of shame. Anything. Mitchell's eyes finally met his, and Elijah saw it there. Hesitation? Regret. "Understood," Elijah said, his voice flat. "I'll leave." He turned on his heel and walked out of the boardroom, his head held high. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him defeated. Outside the hospital, the air was colder than before. Elijah stood by his car, his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, to shout, to tear apart the thin veil of civility these men had hidden behind. But he didn't. He couldn't. He had spent a lifetime learning to hold his anger, to control it. Elijah pulled out his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Elijah." Victor Ellis, an old friend and civil rights attorney, sounded surprised. "Everything all right?" Elijah exhaled slowly, his voice calm but tight. "Victor, I think I need your help." That night, Elijah sat in his study, papers and notes spread across his desk. Victor had arrived hours earlier, and the two men were deep in conversation. "This reeks of a setup," Victor said, pacing the room. "Barnes, the board, the complaint, none of it adds up." "They're trying to force me out," Elijah replied, his tone clipped. "They don't want me here, Victor. They never have." Victor stopped pacing, his expression hardening. "Then we fight. We gather evidence, we challenge their claims, and we make this public if we have to." Elijah looked at Victor, his jaw tight. "You know what this will mean for me, for my career." Victor's voice softened. "I know, but Elijah, if you don't fight back, they win, and they'll keep doing this to men like you." Elijah leaned back in his chair, exhaustion creeping into his bones. He had spent his entire life fighting to prove himself, to be more, to do more, to break every barrier placed in front of him, and yet, here he was, accused, undermined, erased. He closed his eyes for a long moment before opening them, his gaze steady. "Let's do it." The next morning, Elijah stepped into Crestview Town Hall. He had requested a formal meeting with the hospital board to challenge their decision, and Victor had joined him. As they entered the lobby, Elijah noticed how quickly heads turned, how whispers spread like wildfire. Klein and Barnes were already there, standing near the conference room doors. Barnes smirked when he saw Elijah, but Klein's face was harder to read, polished and guarded, as always. "Dr. Monroe," Klein said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "This is unexpected." Victor stepped forward, his briefcase in hand. "We're here to challenge the suspension. You'll find our argument well prepared." Klein's smile faltered for just a moment before he gestured toward the conference room. "Shall we?" Elijah walked past Barnes without sparing him a glance, but he could feel the man's eyes on him. Hungry, waiting. As they settled into the room, Victor laid out documents and notes, his presence commanding. "We're requesting a formal review of the complaint," Victor began. "You suspended Dr. Monroe based on hearsay and conjecture. There's no evidence of wrongdoing, and you know it." Klein's expression darkened, but before he could respond, the door opened abruptly. A uniformed officer stepped inside. Officer Derek Harlan. The same deputy from the diner. His presence sent a chill through the room. "What's this?" Victor demanded. Harlan ignored him, his eyes fixed on Elijah. "Dr. Monroe, I'm afraid I need you to come with me." Elijah frowned, rising slowly. "For what reason?" Harlan's lips curved into a smirk, and he pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "There's been a report of prescription fraud. We've received allegations that you've been mishandling medication supplies. I have a warrant for your arrest." The room fell into stunned silence. Elijah stared at Harlan, his heart pounding. "This is a lie." Klein remained seated, watching it all unfold with cold indifference. Barnes's smirk widened, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. Victor stood, his voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. You can't arrest him on unfounded accusations." Harlan shrugged. "We can, and we will." He stepped toward Elijah, his hand on his cuffs. "Dr. Monroe, are you coming quietly, or do we need to do this the hard way?" Elijah looked around the room, the smugness on Barnes's face, the silence of the board members, the predatory gleam in Harlan's eyes. For the first time in years, rage threatened to consume him. But he wouldn't let it. "Not here." Elijah straightened his shoulders, holding Harlan's gaze. "I'll come with you." The cuffs clicked around his wrists. As Harlan led him out of the room, Elijah kept his head high, ignoring the stares of onlookers in the hall. But inside, he was already planning his next move. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The drive to the Crestview police station was silent, save for the hum of the cruiser's engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Elijah sat in the back seat, his wrists bound by cold metal cuffs, his gaze fixed out the window. The town passed in flashes, the diner on Willow Street, the hospital where he'd spent countless hours saving lives, the park where children played without a care in the world. Now, those same streets seemed smaller, sharper, like they were closing in on him. He could feel the weight of 1,000 invisible eyes watching him, judging him, as the cruiser passed. Officer Derek Harlan sat in the driver's seat, his posture relaxed, a smug smile playing at the corner of his mouth. He caught Elijah's gaze in the rearview mirror. "You don't say much, do you?" Harlan drawled, his tone laced with false amusement. "I'd have figured a big-shot doctor like you would have a lot to say about this." Elijah didn't respond. He refused to give Harlan the satisfaction of seeing his frustration. "Guess you're not used to people holding you accountable," Harlan continued, his voice baiting. "Men like you always think you're untouchable." Elijah finally turned his head, meeting Harlan's eyes in the mirror. His voice was calm, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. "I know exactly what kind of man I am, Officer Harlan. The question is, do you?" Harlan's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, and Elijah looked away again. At the station, Elijah was led through the front entrance, his hands still cuffed. The police station was small, the kind of place where everything happened in plain view. Phones rang, officers milled about, and a few civilians sat waiting in chairs, eyes turning toward him with open curiosity as he passed. Elijah kept his head high. He would not be humiliated. Harlan guided him to a desk at the back of the room, where a uniformed officer, Detective Neil Carmichael, sat flipping through a folder. Carmichael was a graying man, with a deep furrowed brow and an air of indifference. He barely looked up as Elijah approached. "Dr. Monroe," Carmichael said, his voice monotone. "Take a seat." Elijah sat. Harlan hovered behind him, arms crossed, his satisfaction obvious. "Detective," Elijah said evenly, "I assume you'll explain what exactly I've been accused of." Carmichael flipped a page in the file. "Prescription fraud falsifying medication records. There's evidence that a large amount of oxycodone has gone missing from the hospital's supply. The pattern points to your authorization code." Elijah's stomach dropped, though his face remained impassive. This was bigger than he'd thought. "That's impossible," he said firmly. "My code is secure. If medication has gone missing, someone's planted it under my name." Carmichael finally looked up, his expression blank. "We'll see. For now, we need you to sit tight. You'll have a chance to explain yourself soon enough." Harlan leaned in, his voice low and mocking. "Might take a while, though. You know how these things go." Elijah turned to face him, his calm exterior hardening. "Careful, officer, you're starting to sound like a man enjoying this." Harlan straightened, his smirk returning. "Just doing my job, doctor." "Then I suggest you do it properly," Elijah shot back. Carmichael's phone rang, interrupting the tension. He waved Harlan away and picked up the receiver, leaving Elijah alone at the desk. Around him, officers whispered in clusters, their eyes darting in his direction. He could hear it in their silence. Their judgment. Hours passed. Elijah sat in a holding room with nothing but a plastic chair and a buzzing fluorescent light for company. He thought of his patients, his staff, the surgery he'd missed because of this absurdity. He thought of Klein, of Barnes, of the smug looks on their faces as this plan unfolded exactly as they had designed. But most of all, Elijah thought of his resolve. He would not break. The door creaked open, and Victor Ellis strode in, his face a mask of controlled fury. The lawyer dropped his briefcase onto the table and sat across from Elijah, his voice sharp. "They're trying to bury you," Victor said without preamble. "I just spoke with the detective. They claim they found irregularities in your prescription logs going back months." Elijah exhaled slowly, his jaw tight. "You know that's a lie." "Of course I do. But they're playing dirty. They've fed this to the media too. Klein's doing. I'd bet money on it." Elijah looked up sharply. "The media?" Victor's nod was grim. "I got a call from a reporter at the Crestview Gazette asking for a comment. Someone's making sure this goes public before you have a chance to defend yourself." Elijah's fists tightened on the table. It was worse than he thought. "They're building a narrative." Victor's voice softened. "They're trying to destroy you, Elijah. You don't think Klein and Barnes started this alone, do you? This is the system circling its wagons." Elijah stared at the wall, his mind racing. The anger he had fought to control now burned through him like a wildfire, but he refused to let it consume him. He looked back at Victor, his voice quiet but unyielding. "What do we do?" Victor's eyes gleamed with resolve. "We fight back, but we do it smart. First, we gather evidence, every log, every report. Someone planted this, and we'll prove it. I'm filing motions to get you released tonight." "And then?" Victor's voice was hard. "And then we burn their story to the ground." By the time Elijah stepped out of the station later that evening, the sun had set. Reporters had already gathered outside, cameras flashing and microphones thrust in his direction. "Dr. Monroe, do you have a statement? Are the accusations true? What do you say to the patients who trusted you?" Elijah stopped on the station steps, his face calm and composed despite the chaos around him. The cameras flashed, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire world was watching. Victor stepped in beside him, his voice clear and loud. "Dr. Monroe will not be answering questions at this time. These accusations are false, and we intend to prove that. Thank you." Elijah walked down the steps, ignoring the shouted questions and flashing lights. As they reached Victor's car, Elijah glanced back at the station. In the shadows, he could see Harlan and Klein watching from the windows, their silhouettes dark against the light. This wasn't over, not even close. Late that night, Elijah sat in his study, staring at the documents Victor had sent over. The evidence against him was thin, fabricated, Elijah was certain, but thin wouldn't be enough to win. He needed proof. Proof that Klein, Barnes, and whoever else was involved had orchestrated this. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Mitchell," Elijah said when the voice on the other end answered. There was a pause. "Elijah, I don't know if I should be talking to you." "I need your help," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I know you know something. This isn't just about me. It's bigger than that." A heavy silence hung between them before Mitchell finally replied, his voice hesitant but resolute. "Meet me tomorrow morning. I'll tell you what I know." Elijah's heart pounded, but he kept his voice calm. "Thank you, Mitchell." As he hung up the phone, Elijah sat back in his chair, his mind sharp and focused. They thought they could break him. They thought they could bury him. But they underestimated just how far he was willing to go to fight back. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The rain came down in sheets the following morning, the relentless patter against Elijah Monroe's windshield, mirroring the storm raging inside him. He gripped the steering wheel tightly as he pulled into the gravel lot of Crestview's abandoned Millworks depot, the place Mitchell had chosen for their meeting. Elijah stepped out of his car, pulling his coat tight against the wind as he scanned the area. The depot loomed ahead, its rusted frame and shattered windows a relic of the town's long-gone industrial days. Elijah's shoes crunched against broken glass and gravel as he approached. "Mitchell?" Elijah called, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Here," a voice replied, low and shaky. Mitchell Crane stepped out from behind a crumbling pillar, his face pale, his suit wrinkled. He looked around nervously, as though expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "You picked a dramatic location," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. What's going on, Mitchell? Mitchell ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Elijah, I don't have much time. I've been digging into the hospital's records like you asked. And? Mitchell hesitated before shoving a folder into Elijah's hands. It's all here, the logs, the fake authorizations. Someone's been manipulating the system for months. Your access code was cloned, but it wasn't you. Elijah flipped through the papers, his eyes narrowing. Who? Mitchell swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. It's Barnes, and Klein knew he's been covering for him because Barnes's father-in-law sits on the hospital's largest donor board. They've been using you as a scapegoat to hide the real fraud. Elijah's pulse roared in his ears, his hands tightening around the folder. You're sure about this? Positive, Mitchell said. But you need to move fast. Klein's calling a meeting with the hospital trustees this afternoon to push for your permanent suspension, if he gets there first. The sound of tires skidding on gravel cut Mitchell off. They both turned toward the lot, where a black SUV had pulled in, its headlights slicing through the rain. The driver's door opened, and Officer Derek Harlan stepped out, a slow, smug smile spreading across his face. Well, look at this, Harlan drawled, his voice carrying through the wind. I knew you'd be here, Doc. Elijah tensed as Harlan approached, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon. Mitchell stepped back, his face draining of color. What are you doing here, officer? Elijah demanded, his voice cold and controlled. Following up on some new leads, Harlan said, though his tone suggested otherwise. You've been real busy, haven't you? Doc meeting in abandoned buildings, dragging poor Mitchell here into the middle of things. He glanced at the folder in Elijah's hands. What's that? None of your business, Elijah replied. Harlan's smile didn't waver, but his eyes darkened. Everything about you is my business now, hand it over. No. The word was sharp, unyielding. Harlan's smirk faltered. You think you get to say no? I'm the law around here. No, you're not, Elijah shot back, stepping forward. You're a bully with a badge. You're here because Klein and Barnes are using you to finish what they started, and you're either too blind or too corrupt to see it. Harlan's face flushed red, his hand twitching toward his holster. Watch your mouth, Doc. Mitchell stepped in. Derek, this has nothing to do with you. Shut up, Harlan snapped, pointing a finger at him. You think I don't know whose side you're on? Elijah took a breath, steadying himself. You're not here for justice, Harlan. You're here because men like Klein are afraid of the truth. You can't intimidate me into silence. Harlan's jaw tightened, and in an instant, he lunged forward, grabbing for the folder in Elijah's hands. Elijah stepped back, his heart pounding as the two struggled. Let go, Harlan growled. Elijah refused, his grip firm. You're not getting this. With a shove, Harlan sent Elijah stumbling back, the folder slipping from his hands. The papers scattered across the wet ground, the ink already starting to blur in the rain. Harlan bent down to gather them, his expression triumphant. But before he could pick them up, a new voice cut through the chaos. That's enough. All three men turned toward the source. Victor Ellis stood at the edge of the lot, his coat flapping in the wind, his voice booming behind him. A second car pulled in. This one unmarked, but carrying a pair of state investigators Elijah had never seen before. Harlan froze, the papers still half in his hand. What the hell is this? Victor strode forward, his voice sharp. This, Officer Harlan, is the beginning of your end. We have evidence that this entire case against Dr. Monroe has been fabricated, and your role in harassing him has been noted. He gestured to the state investigators. These men are here to ensure this investigation is handled properly. You've overplayed your hand. Harlan straightened, trying to regain control. You can't just... Enough, Victor interrupted, his eyes blazing. I suggest you step away and let these gentlemen do their jobs. The two investigators approached calmly, their presence commanding one of them. A tall woman, with a no-nonsense demeanor, gestured toward Harlan. Step aside, officer, we'll take it from here. For the first time, Elijah saw something flicker in Harlan's eyes. Uncertainty. He looked between Victor, the investigators, and Elijah, as though realizing the tides had turned. Slowly, he stepped back, his face twisting with frustration. Mitchell moved quickly to gather the remaining papers from the ground, handing them to Victor. It's all there, he said, his voice trembling. Victor nodded. "We'll make sure this gets where it needs to go." Elijah stood tall, his gaze fixed on Harlan. "You thought you could break me," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the rain. "You underestimated me, just like everyone else who's tried to silence the truth." Harlan didn't reply. He turned sharply, walking back to his SUV without another word. As the investigators began discussing the next steps with Victor and Mitchell, Elijah let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest beginning to ease. For the first time in days, he felt the faintest glimmer of victory, but he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Victor approached, placing a reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. "We've turned the tables. Elijah Klein and Barnes won't be able to hide from this much longer, but we need to be ready. This is going to get messy." Elijah nodded, his expression resolute. "Let it, I'm ready." As he looked back at the crumbling depot, rain washing the dirt and blood from its broken surface, Elijah knew this fight was far from finished, but for the first time, he wasn't standing alone. They had underestimated him. Now they would face the truth. And with uncertainty. As Elijah climbed into Victor's car, the phone in his pocket buzzed. He pulled it out and froze when he saw the caller ID. Unknown number. Victor glanced at him. "Everything okay?" Elijah didn't answer. He stared at the screen, his gut twisting. He knew that whoever was on the other end, they weren't calling to congratulate him. He answered, his voice steady. "This is Dr. Monroe." A pause. Then a voice, low, deliberate, and unmistakably familiar. "Did you really think you'd won?" The line went dead. Elijah lowered the phone slowly, his heart pounding. Whatever had just begun, it was far from over. The sun was just beginning to rise as Elijah Monroe stood at the steps of Crestview General Hospital. The morning air was sharp, the light filtering through a layer of thin gray clouds. To anyone else, this would have been an ordinary day. But Elijah knew better. This day would decide everything. In his hand, he gripped the folder Mitchell had given him. It was water-stained and slightly torn, but inside lay the proof he needed to expose Barnes, Klein, and the corrupt network they had built. Prescription logs falsified under Elijah's name, manipulation of donor funds, and clear evidence that Barnes had been stealing medication supplies for months. The stakes had never been higher. Victor Ellis, sharp in his charcoal gray suit, stood beside Elijah. His voice cut through the stillness. "They're going to come at you with everything they have. You're ready for this?" Elijah turned his head, calm but resolute. "I've been ready my whole life." Together, they pushed through the hospital's glass doors, heading straight for the conference room where Klein had gathered the hospital board and senior administrators. The walls seemed to hum with anticipation as Elijah and Victor walked through the sterile white hallways. Doctors and nurses glanced up, pausing mid-conversation, their gazes following Elijah like shadows. At the far end of the hall stood Klein and Dr. Barnes, flanked by two uniformed officers, one of whom was Officer Derek Harlan, the same man who had cuffed Elijah days before. Barnes's smirk widened when he saw Elijah approach. "Dr. Monroe," Klein said smoothly, his tone oozing false cordiality. "You're early." "I didn't want to keep you waiting," Elijah replied, his voice steady. Barnes leaned forward, his arrogance thick in the air. "I hope you didn't come to cause a scene, Elijah. You're already in enough trouble as it is." Elijah ignored him, his eyes locked on Klein. "Let's get this over with." The boardroom was silent, save for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Klein sat at the head of the long oak table, with Barnes on his right and Harlan hovering like a sentry at the back of the room. The other board members, men and women who had sat silently through Elijah's suspension, fidgeted uncomfortably in their seats. Victor took his place next to Elijah, setting the water-damaged folder on the table with a quiet thud. "Elijah," Klein began, leaning back in his chair, "I'll be direct. You've been accused of serious misconduct, misuse of hospital resources, prescription fraud, and compromising patient care. This board is prepared to finalize your suspension unless you have a very compelling explanation." Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Klein's. "I do, and what I have is more than an explanation. I have the truth." Klein's smile wavered, but he recovered quickly. "The truth?" Victor opened the folder, pulling out copies of the falsified records. These documents prove that Dr. Monroe's access code was cloned and used to manipulate the hospital's prescription logs. He slid the pages across the table. You'll notice irregularities tied to high-demand medications like oxycodone. These discrepancies date back months, long before any of these accusations were brought against my client. The board members murmured among themselves, their eyes scanning the documents. Klein's expression darkened. "This doesn't prove anything," Barnes snapped, his voice sharp. "Codes get compromised all the time, it's not unheard of." Victor raised a brow. "True. But what's interesting is that these discrepancies align perfectly with your shift schedules, Dr. Barnes. And, as the logs show, you were the last one to access the storage rooms during those windows." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Barnes's smirk faltered for the first time. "This is absurd," Barnes said, his voice rising. "You're making baseless accusations to deflect from your own failures." Elijah's voice cut through the noise, calm but lethal. "I saved lives while you were stealing from the patients who trusted this hospital. You let your greed, your ego, put people at risk, and then you used me as your cover because you thought no one would believe a black man over you." Barnes stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do," Elijah said, rising to his feet. His voice filled the room, low and steady, but brimming with power. "You couldn't stand that someone like me could walk into this hospital and excel. You've resented me from day one, because I don't fit the mold you think I should." Klein, whose face had grown paler with every word, raised a hand. "This is getting out of hand, Dr. Monroe. You're making very serious allegations without proof." Elijah's jaw tightened. "You want proof?" He turned to the board. "You've buried complaints against Barnes before, haven't you? Nurses who came forward about missing medications, staff members who questioned discrepancies in the storage room. You silenced them. How many lives did you risk protecting him?" The room fell into stunned silence. Mitchell Crane, who had been seated quietly at the far end of the table, finally spoke up. His voice trembled, but his words were clear. "He's right," Mitchell said. All eyes turned to him. "I saw the logs. I saw the emails Klein knew." Klein shot Mitchell a sharp glare. "Mr. Crane, I strongly suggest you—" "No," Mitchell said, his voice gaining strength. "I'm done covering for you." Klein slammed his hand on the table. "Enough." Victor stepped forward, his voice cutting through Klein's outburst. "The evidence we've presented here is damning. Dr. Monroe has been targeted, harassed, and falsely accused to cover up Barnes's misconduct and Klein's complicity. If this board refuses to act, we'll take this to the press, the state medical board, and the courts." The threat hung heavy in the air. Klein sank back into his chair, his face ashen. Barnes looked as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. For a moment, no one moved. Then Elijah spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. "This isn't just about me," he said, looking around the room. "It's about the people who rely on us. It's about the trust we're supposed to uphold. You can't let men like Barnes and Klein destroy that, because of their greed and their prejudice." The board members exchanged glances, the weight of Elijah's words settling over them. Finally, one of the older board members, a woman who had been silent until now, spoke. "I think we've heard enough." Her voice was steady, decisive. "This board will conduct an independent review of these accusations and the evidence presented here. Effective immediately, Dr. Barnes is suspended pending investigation." Barnes spun toward her. "What you can't—" "Sit down, Dr. Barnes," she said coldly. Elijah exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. For the first time Victor placed a hand on his arm, offering a small nod. It wasn't over, but the tide had turned. As the room began to empty, Elijah turned to Klein. "You underestimated me," he said quietly, "but I'll make sure you never underestimate anyone like me again." Klein didn't respond. For the first time, the man who had wielded power with such arrogance looked small, a man brought low by his own corruption. Outside the hospital, the rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. Elijah and Victor stood on the steps, watching the board members and staff leave in tense clusters. Victor turned to him. "You did it, Elijah. You took them on, and you won." Elijah nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful. It's not just about winning, Victor. It's about making sure this never happens again. Victor smiled faintly. And you will, one step at a time. As Elijah looked out at the horizon, the weight of the battle he had just fought settled over him. The fight wasn't finished, not yet, but he had made his stand. And no one would silence him again. End with uncertainty. Elijah's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. "This is Dr. Monroe." A voice, calm and measured but chilling, spoke on the other end. "You think this is over, don't you? You don't know what you've started." The line went dead. Elijah lowered the phone, his jaw tightening. Whatever was coming, he would be ready. The day after the boardroom confrontation, Crestview buzzed with whispers. It was the kind of small-town gossip that moved faster than facts. Stories of Dr. Elijah Monroe's stand against Klein, Barnes, and the hospital's corruption spread like wildfire. Some painted Elijah as a hero, a man who stood up against a rigged system and refused to back down. Others, quieter, but no less venomous, muttered that he was causing trouble where there hadn't been any. But for Elijah Monroe, the truth was enough. In the early afternoon, Elijah sat in Victor's downtown office, staring at a neatly typed letter on the desk in front of him. Resignation. Victor leaned back in his chair, watching Elijah with measured patience. "Barnes is finished," Victor said. "Between the prescription fraud and the donor scandal, he'll be lucky to stay out of jail." Klein's scrambling to save face, but he's been pushed out as president by the board. His reputation won't survive this. "And the hospital?" Elijah asked, his voice low. Victor gave a small nod. "They've agreed to publicly clear your name. It'll take time, but once this investigation is finalized, there'll be a full review of their protocols. You force their hand, Elijah people will lose their jobs, but it's what had to happen." Elijah exhaled, rubbing a hand over his chin. "And yet, I'm still here. Being asked to resign quietly so the board can control the narrative." Victor's voice softened. "You don't have to accept this, Elijah. They want your silence because they're afraid of what you'll say next, but we can fight this." Elijah stared at the letter. He could almost hear Klein's voice in its neat, impersonal tone, a final attempt to erase him gracefully, cleanly, as though he had never been there at all. "I've spent my entire life proving myself," Elijah said finally, his voice calm but firm. "Proving I deserve to be here, proving I belong in rooms people don't want me in." He looked up at Victor, his eyes clear. "I don't need to prove that anymore." Victor frowned. "You're sure?" Elijah nodded. "I'm walking out on my terms, not theirs." Victor leaned forward, his gaze steady. "So what now?" A faint smile crossed Elijah's lips. "Now I move forward." By the evening, Elijah was back at Crestview General Hospital. His name had been cleared, but the tension in the air as he walked through the halls was palpable. Nurses nodded politely. A few staff members offered quiet congratulations, though their voices were hushed, as though afraid someone might hear. Elijah moved with purpose toward his office. He would clear it out tonight, leave nothing behind for them to twist or tarnish. As he rounded the corner, he saw her nurse Claire Yates. Claire was standing outside his office door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked up as he approached, her face conflicted. "Dr. Monroe," she said softly. "Claire," Elijah replied, pausing a few steps away. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Claire took a breath, her voice breaking the silence. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry. For not speaking up sooner. For not—" Elijah shook his head gently, cutting her off. "You did what you thought you had to, Claire. I don't hold that against you." Claire's eyes shimmered with tears. "You didn't deserve any of this. None of us did. And I want you to know that some of us believe in you. We always did." Elijah felt something shift in his chest. A release, small but meaningful. "Thank you," he said quietly. Claire offered a weak smile. "What are you going to do now?" Elijah considered the question for a moment. "Something better." She nodded, as though that was answer enough, and turned to leave. The following week, Crestview's local paper ran a front-page headline. "Corruption exposed at Crestview General Hospital. Dr. Elijah Monroe cleared of charges. The article detailed the prescription fraud scandal, Barnes's suspension, and the board's decision to remove Harold Klein from his position. What it didn't capture, however, were the whispers. The quiet conversations in diners, church pews, and grocery store aisles. Crestview had been shaken, and the cracks were now visible for everyone to see. Elijah sat on his porch that evening, the paper folded beside him. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in streaks of orange and deep blue. He sipped from a glass of water, letting the quiet settle around him. His phone buzzed on the table. He glanced down. Mitchell. "Evening, Mitchell," Elijah said as he answered. "Elijah," Mitchell replied, his voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say, thank you for standing up, for not backing down. I don't think I could have done what you did." Elijah's voice was steady. "You could have. You just didn't know it yet." A silence passed before Mitchell spoke again. "Are you really leaving the hospital?" "I am," Elijah replied. "But leaving doesn't mean I'm finished." "What do you mean?" Elijah smiled faintly. "You'll see soon enough." In the weeks that followed, Elijah's departure from Crestview General sparked more than just gossip, it sparked action. Several staff members, led by Claire and a handful of nurses, began pushing for better oversight in hospital operations. Anonymous letters were sent to the state board, detailing Barnes's abuses and Klein's role in silencing complaints. Elijah had planted the seeds, and now the people of Crestview were tending to them. At the same time, Elijah began receiving calls from neighboring towns and cities. Patients who had heard about the scandal reached out, offering their support and asking where he would go next. Colleagues, fellow black doctors and other professionals who had fought similar battles, reached out to share their own stories. Each conversation strengthened Elijah's resolve. 1 month later, Elijah stood outside the construction site of a new clinic, his hands in his pockets as he watched workers lay the foundation. It wasn't grand or flashy, but it was his, a private practice just outside Crestview, where people of all backgrounds would be welcomed, cared for, and treated with respect. It was a small act of defiance, but an act all the same. Victor joined him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You sure about this place?" Elijah smiled, his gaze fixed on the rising structure. "Crestview may not be ready for me, but I'm not walking away from the people who need me. This clinic isn't just for them, it's for everyone who's been overlooked, ignored, or told they didn't belong." Victor nodded approvingly. "You're building something bigger than yourself." "That's the point," Elijah replied. "It always was. Set up future possibilities." On the day the clinic opened, Elijah stood at the front doors, watching as the first patients trickled inside. He shook hands with familiar faces, former patients, friends, and even a few hospital staff who had quietly chosen to follow him. From across the parking lot, he noticed a black SUV pull in for a moment, his chest tightened. Harlan. But it wasn't Harlan who stepped out. It was a young man, no uniform, no badge, who walked toward Elijah with hesitation. "Dr. Monroe?" the man asked, his voice uncertain. Elijah turned, extending a hand. "Yes?" The man took his hand, shaking it firmly. "My name's Marcus. My mother heard about you. She said you're the kind of doctor this town needs." Elijah looked at him, seeing something familiar in the young man's face, a mixture of hope and determination. "Tell your mother she's welcome here any time," Elijah said with a faint smile. As Marcus walked inside, Elijah turned back to the clinic, the sun breaking through the clouds above it. The fight wasn't over, but as he stood on the threshold of his next chapter, he knew one thing for certain. He was ready. For Elijah Monroe, the measure of a man had never been defined by accolades or titles. It wasn't in the degrees on his wall, or the praise he had earned from prestigious hospitals. No, a man's worth lay in his ability to endure, to stand tall when others tried to tear him down, and to leave the world better than he found it. The battle at Crestview General had tested him in ways he hadn't thought possible. It had stripped him bare of his position, his reputation, and the quiet life he had built in the shadows of a town that never truly welcomed him. But in that breaking, Elijah discovered a truth he had always known, but sometimes forgotten. Strength doesn't come from the absence of struggle. It comes from surviving it. The day the clinic officially opened its doors, Elijah stood in the bright morning sun, reflecting on how far he had come. The sleek modern building stood as a stark contrast to Crestview's aging hospital. But the clinic was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a statement, a promise. A place for the overlooked and underserved to receive care without judgment or prejudice. It wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of resilience. As patients entered, young families, elderly neighbors, workers with weary eyes, Elijah saw something in their faces that gave him peace. Hope Trust people who had heard his name in whispered conversations now spoke it with respect. And while Elijah never sought validation, he understood how powerful it was to be seen, not as a threat, but as a healer. Claire Yates had joined him as head nurse. Leaving the hospital behind, Mitchell Crane had offered his quiet support from behind the scenes, helping connect Elijah to grants and programs that would fund the clinic for years to come. Even Victor Ellis, whose sharp wit and unrelenting drive had been his greatest ally, joked that he would hang around to keep the wolves at bay. Together, they had turned the impossible into reality. But Elijah wasn't naive. He knew the fight wasn't over. For every patient who walked through his doors, there would still be skeptics. For every success, there would be whispers of doubt. And somewhere in the shadowed corners of Crestview, there were men like Klein, Barnes, and Harlan, who still clung to their power, embittered by their loss. But Elijah had long stopped living for their approval. He had taken their worst and risen above it. Late that afternoon, Elijah sat alone in his office. The room was sparse, save for his desk and a single framed photograph on the shelf. It was of his parents, a reminder of the sacrifices they had made so he could be here. His father's words echoed in his memory, words spoken long ago when Elijah was a boy, with big dreams and a chip on his shoulder. "You will have to work twice as hard for half as much, son. But don't let that break you. Let it make you unstoppable." His father had been right. Elijah had fought for every inch of ground he stood on. And now that fight wasn't just for him, it was for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The events at Crestview General had exposed more than just one man's corruption. They had revealed cracks in the system itself. The kind of cracks that allowed men like Barnes to thrive while silencing those who spoke out. The scandal had sparked broader conversations in the town and beyond, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and accountability. A state-led investigation into the hospital was underway, and Barnes faced criminal charges that could result in prison time. Klein, stripped of his position and influence, had faded into the background, a cautionary tale of what happens when power is abused. But for Elijah, the real victory lay in the small, quiet changes that had begun to take root. Nurses who once stayed silent were now pushing for reform. Patients who had been ignored were finally being heard. And in the whispers of conversation at grocery stores and diners, people were asking the right questions, questions about fairness, justice, and equality. Elijah knew change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had begun. And sometimes, that was enough. One evening, as the clinic was closing, Elijah noticed a familiar figure waiting in the lobby. It was Marcus, the young man who had visited the clinic on its opening day. He was seated with his mother, a tired but dignified woman with kind eyes and weathered hands. Elijah approached, offering a warm smile. "Good to see you again, Marcus. How can I help?" Marcus stood, shifting nervously on his feet. "It's my mom," he said quietly. "She hasn't been feeling well, and we heard you'd take good care of her." Elijah nodded, kneeling slightly to meet the woman's gaze. "You're in the right place, ma'am. We'll take care of you." The woman smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, Dr. Monroe." As Elijah led them into an exam room, a sense of purpose settled over him. These were the moments that mattered, the lives he could touch, the people he could serve. That night, Elijah sat on his porch, looking out at the quiet town as the first stars appeared overhead. The battle had cost him much, but it had also given him something far more valuable: clarity. He thought about the patients he'd treated, the lives he'd saved, and the people who now stood beside him. His fight had been personal, but its impact was rippling outward, changing the way people saw him, and perhaps more importantly, the way they saw themselves. This was the measure of a man. Not in the battles he avoided, but in the ones he faced head-on, not in the silence he kept, but in the truth he spoke, not in how the world saw him, but in how he chose to see the world. As Elijah leaned back in his chair, the phone on the table buzzed softly. It was Victor. "You still awake?" Victor's voice carried a teasing edge. Elijah chuckled. "Barely." "You hear about the town hall next week?" Victor asked. "A group of community leaders is calling for new oversight policies. They're pushing for a formal accountability committee. They want you to come speak." Elijah was quiet for a moment, the weight of Victor's words settling over him. "Me?" Victor laughed. "Of course you. Whether you like it or not, Elijah, you've become the face of something bigger. People need to see that change is possible." Elijah smiled faintly, his voice thoughtful. "Then I'll be there." Victor's tone softened. "You did good, Elijah, real good." As the call ended, Elijah set the phone down and looked out at the horizon. The fight wasn't over. Not for him, not for Crestview, not for the countless others still living in the shadows. But tonight, there was peace. A quiet, hard-earned peace. And in that peace, Elijah Monroe knew his work was only beginning. Elijah's journey was never just about one man's fight. It was about a system that demanded change, a community that needed a voice, and a reminder that the fight for justice is never truly finished. It's carried forward by those with the courage to stand. The events in Crestview exposed the flaws in the structures meant to protect people, but they also revealed something greater: resilience. Elijah's story was proof that even in the face of prejudice, corruption, and betrayal, truth could prevail. To those who watched his journey unfold, Elijah's stand was a call to action. A reminder that progress begins with one person, one voice refusing to be silenced. As the stars spread across the night sky, Elijah closed his eyes, breathing deeply. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, and new opportunities to heal, but tonight, he rested. For he had measured himself against the weight of the world, and he had emerged.